One of the most common questions which breeders often ask about EBVs or estimated breeding values is, do they accurately predict the performance of progeny that we see when we take a group of animals and then use them in a breeding program and measure the performance for that particular trait? So to evaluate that, in the case of the structural soundness EBVs, which are published within the Trans-Tasman Angus cattle evaluation, so the breeding values for foot angle and claw set, Angus Australia recently conducted an analysis where we went through and identified sires within the Angus breed that had 5 or more progeny which had been scored for each of the particular structural traits, so foot angle and claw set. And that identified around, there was around 2,300 sires, or 2,317 to be precise. So of those sires, they all had structural soundness breeding values. Those sires were ranked on their breeding value for each particular trait, and then divided into quartiles. So divided into 4 groups, being the highest, so 25% were placed in the first quartile, the next 25% into the second quartile, the 50 to 75th% kind of band were put into the third quartile, and the bottom 25% of sires were put into the bottom quartile. And then for sires in each of those quartiles, we went through and calculated what the average score was on the progeny for each particular trait, being claw set and foot angle, and also the percentage of progeny of the sires in each quartile that had a score of 5 and 6, which is often considered to be kind of acceptable structure for those particular traits. So if we look at the results of that analysis, you'll see here 2 different graphics. These graphics just reflect the validation, I suppose, of the claw set breeding values. So you see on the graphic on the left, if we go through and have a look at that, this is the average progeny score of sires in each particular quartile. So we can see the average score for claw set of the sires in the highest quartile, so those with the most favourable EBV, had a average progeny score of just over 6, and that generally increased up until the sires in the bottom quartile, if you like, in quartile 4. The average score of progeny of those sires was 6.46. So there was a general decrease, and the average progeny scores which we saw correlated closely with what was expected from the breeding values of those animals for claw set. If we look at the graphic on the right-hand side, which is the number of progeny with a score of 5 or 6, we could see we had a similar trend in what was observed was very close to what was expected. So those animals in the highest quartile had almost 80% of progeny which had a score of 5 or 6, and that went down in the size in the bottom quartile to only 54% of progeny with a score of 5 or 6. So this was for claw set. Very similar results were observed for foot angle. So the take-home message really is that Angus breeders can have confidence that the structural soundness EBVs for claw set and foot angle are doing a really good job of predicting the performance that we'll start to see, or the structural soundness that we'll see in the progeny of animals, and they can be used with a lot of confidence when making selection decisions.